But this is
Mm.
the No Fucks Given podcast. We talk all about living your authentic life. A lot of times we talk about deep, dark subjects like suffering, as we will today. And my name is Ryan Perry, and I am co-hosted with my buddy Will Cordingley. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Ryan. Good to be here with you. And we're
Good to
doing
be
a
here.
good we're doing a nice leading by example here. We're suffering in the
Just we
technological realm
just we
just
just
to like
suffer.
get the energy going here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do.
Mhm.
And actually, it is Harry Truman. I did a little bit of research before the show. Harry Truman said that the reward of suffering is experience.
Hmm.
Or does
That
experience
very
cause
accurate.
suffering? Is it one of those constant loops, kind of like belief and
Yeah.
reality?
Yeah.
Or it's not belief and reality. What is it? Belief and experience?
Experience. Yeah.
Experience. Thank you. So,
Well, that's
uh,
interesting.
yeah, so we're going to just rock and roll on good old. I'm going to shut down YouTube. I mean, if they're going to be that way, might as well just shut them down, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to be streaming
Shut
to
it
them if they're going to
down.
be that way. We'll
YouTube, why
see
you gotta
about
do
this.
us like this?
Why you got to be like that? We're not Chappelle.
Yeah.
Come on, folks.
Come
Come
on.
on. Come on.
We're only pushing inner boundaries, not, social ones.
All in due time. All in due time.
Yeah.
Although all bound, if you're interacting with people, I guess at that point you are working in social boundaries at some level in some way.
Yeah, and we kind of have this huge myth that we're all there's like this overarching massive fantasy about humanity that we want to believe that people are angelic and altruistic and good, and in reality we're pretty different and pretty divided and
Right.
still pretty tribal, and we still have to make it work. We're like it's a metaphor for a big family. It's
Right.
like if you're in a country with a bunch of people, there's a bunch of different agendas within that country, but you're still in a country together. You got to make
Right.
it work.
Right.
You may not
Yeah.
like everyone in your family, but if at all possible, you want to make it work.
Yeah.
That's how it goes.
It's interesting, and hopefully we don't get too deep on this thread.
Yeah.
But it dawned on me listening. I was listening. Oh, lost his name. Not Colbert. The guy that's on HBO.
Bill Maher?
Bill Maher. Thank you. I was listening to him. He had some people on that were talking about what's going on, and from that conversation, it kind of dawned on me that it's almost, what's old is new again. And, we talk a lot about cycles, how cycles repeat themselves. We
Yeah.
live in cycles. We repeat behaviors over and over again. And I don't know if it was last week or the week before, we were even kind of talking about, oh, okay, well, as a country, if a country was an entity, if you think about all the energy
Mhm.
and just a country, the cycles that it repeats. I don't think we got into the fourth turning and how we're in the fourth turning, and that the United
Mhm.
States historically seems to go through these 80-year cycles, but everything
Not
goes.
last week, but a long
Yeah,
time
it was a
ago
long
we
time
did.
ago.
Yeah.
So essentially, though, there's a reason why history repeats itself. It's the same reason, I believe, is why human behavior repeats itself. It's just we're repeatable people. That's just the way we're wired and built, the natural way our brain works. So if you think about kind of the old days, if you will, and when I say old days, like 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, church and state. The church was an absolute. The church
Mhm.
said, this is the way it is. This is how life is going to be. This is who you need to be in order to be a good person. And if you do not comply, and if you're outside of those lines, you are then no good. And you
Mhm.
are outside the lines. You could be removed from the church. Worst case, you could be removed from the church. And then, of course, everybody's going to scorn you, look down on you, and those types of things. And I'm like, wow, have we gone full cycle? it's like the people that said, hey, we want our freedom, we want our uniqueness, we want to be able to be ourselves, we don't want to be constrained by social norms and by church values, are now saying this is the only way it can be. And if you're against us, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it's like,
it's
like, oh my gosh, we've just gone full circle. Those that they felt have been oppressing them, those that they felt who have been oppressing them for so many years, they've now come full cycle and they're trying to oppress other people.
Yeah, it absolutely happens. And when you grow up in certain kinds of families and have certain experiences, you get hip to the power game at an early age and how it kind of operates in the world. And if you have a bit of consciousness and thoughtfulness, you can see how it just permeates every aspect of humanity and how it operates, especially and we talk a lot about childhood development here. It's like the most controlling, most dominant, most narcissistic people on the planet are kids, and we were all kids at some point. And if trauma and patterns and like problems back then freeze parts of your mind or people's minds in those ages, you grow up and you present as a human adult, but you act like a narcissistic baby child. And that causes all kinds of problems, because to compensate for that, usually these people are very charming and charismatic and fun to be around and exciting, and they're compelling in a lot of ways, and it hides the truth of what's going on. But the fact that history repeats
people, you're talking about the narcissistic.
Narcissistic, borderline, any sort of, and it doesn't have to be full on diagnosable. I think of these things on a spectrum of, if you want to say 1 to 10, right? Like on these personality spectrums, all of us are floating around like a 1 or a 2, unless you're at a 9 or a 10. And then under stress, all of us tend to move up the scale, like we all get in the worst versions of ourselves every once in a while. And that's how it happens. But to your point about history repeating itself, that seems to be the case. I don't know why that is, other than I think it's because as a whole, as a generalized statement, we don't know our history. So it just repeats itself and it doesn't complete, because patterns inside of our minds, it's like, let's go from humanity to you right now, you meaning the listener. Like all patterns repeat until they're completed inside of us. We hold these things alive inside of us, and they keep knocking at our door saying, hey, are you paying attention to me? No, you're not? Okay, well, we'll just keep cycling around and around and around until something gets done about this, or until you perish, basically, one or the other. And humanity seems to operate that way too. Yeah, you got a couple options there. But these corrections seem to happen, right? The stock market is predictable to have a correction about every 7 or 8 years, something like that. And no one really knows why, but you can notice it in the data. It just happens. And humans seem to kind of be that way too. But the people who are yelling the loudest about being oppressed, if given the opportunity, as a generalized statement, are probably pretty happy to do the oppressing if they could, because that's the model in their mind that they're operating from. It's what they know. It's not necessarily because anyone's bad or good. I don't think it's like throw morality out the window. I don't think it's the most useful way to look at people. But I mean, that's the cold, hard reality.
Yeah.
And it's a form of suffering. If you need one of the deepest, most pernicious forms of suffering, and it's like everyone like, what the hell are these guys talking about? All right, here's how this is related. It's like, in my opinion, one of the deepest forms of suffering, and it may not be experienced this way, but it's absolutely true, is the need to have the world and other people be different so that you can be okay or get what you want. That is a deep, deep, deep pernicious, dark form of suffering that
Right.
permeates every second and every breath of your life if you operate that way. Because it's impossible. It's untenable. You can't do it. So you will suffer deeply. Maybe you'll use righteousness or talk about how innocent you are and how victimized you are and all this stuff to, and it'll feel good for a second. It's like emotional junk food. It's great to eat for a little bit
Right.
until you feel like garbage again. And I don't know. It's like
Yeah.
there's got to be a better way, but probably not in our lifetime. We'll see what happens.
Well, and yeah, it's interesting you talk about how history and the cycles, but we haven't lived history. We've only lived our history. And so it would be,
Mhm.
if you had to live through World War II, as an example, in England through the bombings, you would have
Mhm.
a very different experience of that history by living through it versus, oh yeah, I've read about it. You
Yeah,
do not have the same experience reading about it than that you
yeah,
do experiencing it. So yeah, it's really interesting. And then you bring suffering in. I think you kind of alluded to it at one point that for some people, suffering is almost a way of life. It's part of their knowing that they're alive. And so I
mhm,
think part of what what we want to talk about is kind of let's define what is the suffering that we're going to talk about.
yeah.
Um, and I found some information from Buddha because I always like to go. I'm always curious whenever you talk about the human mind is pre. I'm not going to say pre-science. I'm not sure exactly how I want to define it, but I always love going back to the early times when people weren't distracted by living in a nice house. They weren't distracted by who was playing Sunday night on the football. They weren't
Mhm,
distracted by if there was a sale and could they get the meat that they want for the barbecue on Saturday. They
mhm,
were actually distracted by living, and they didn't really have a lot of other distractions going on. So if we go back to the
mm.
1200 and all those types of things, the distraction was living. And I think it allowed
Like
a lot of,
surviving, you mean?
yeah,
Or
yes,
like
thank
that
you.
kind of thing?
Surviving.
Okay,
Yeah, it
okay.
was really about doing that. And then you get these philosophers, and they really were able to just spend a lot of time, especially if they didn't have to go work and do something. Maybe they belonged to a wealthy family or they were able to talk in the public, and that's how they made their living. They spent a lot of time because they didn't have any of these other distractions to really think about the human condition and really kind of analyze it and understand it from a human, like just really being able to dive into the human experience, if you will. And
Mhm,
so I'm always curious, like, especially Eastern philosophy, how would the Chinese look at it? How would the Japanese look at it?
mhm,
How would they define suffering? And typically,
yeah.
those Eastern um, countries, part of the culture was you didn't provide answers. If I said, "Hey, daddy, daddy, um, I feel bad, something happened, Johnny stole my whatever," Eastern philosophy would then probably ask the kid a question about their experience so they could have a deeper understanding
Oh,
of their experience, right? Versus, "Daddy, daddy, Johnny stole my kid or my
mhm,
toy." Okay, well, let me go over and I'll talk to Johnny for you. You don't have to worry about it, kid. It's like, okay,
got it.
I don't have. So it's just a different way of thinking. So
Well, it's a
as
way
a
of evoking learning, right? When you
yeah,
ask a
at a much
question,
deeper
it comes
level, I
from
think.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
more of a really kind of going inside, if you will, and really being able to go deep in perspective. And so I was kind of looking up suffering and how is it defined and those types of
Mhm,
things. Um, I found an article that talked about Buddha, and when he presented the Four Noble Truths, he identified craven as the original origin or cause of suffering. And then it has some additional language that I'm not going to butcher because it's native language.
mhm,
The terms are typically translated as craving, but also refer to as thirst, desire, longing, wish, and greed. And although craving isn't the only cause of suffering, it's always listed first and considered to be the principal, all-pervading, most palpable, and immediate cause. And then it states that there are 3 roots to suffering. There's the suffering of the suffering, and that includes the pain of birth, old age, sickness, and death. So that would be one line of suffering. Then there's the suffering of change, as everything in the world is impermanent and won't last. Some people will suffer that things change. And then the pervasive suffering, an underlying sense of insecurity, anxiety, or basic dissatisfaction. And I think when it comes to suffering, that's kind of the one that we're going to be keying in today's show, is that third one, which is the all-pervasive suffering, an underlying sense of insecurity, anxiety, or basic dissatisfaction.
It's almost existential or something.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Buddhism, but you hear the kind of line, it's like, to eliminate suffering, you have no desires, or something to that effect. There's that kind of idea. And I don't know, that's never really landed as that useful inside of me. Maybe it's because I haven't meditated on it for 30 years, or maybe it's because it just seems counter to how human brains work. But
and it's almost like, well, if I transcend high enough, then it's almost like leaving the body, I would imagine. And therefore, if there's no connection, then I have no connection to the human suffering, and therefore I'm not suffering. And I agree with you. I don't think that really benefits or serves anyone. However, I did align with the fact that the kind of the underlining cause a lot of times is going to be insecurity, anxiety, or general dissatisfaction. It's like,
absolutely.
And those are things that we can control. We have choice, right? It's we can't control the experience, but how we perceive the experience, how we work with, deal with, perceive again the experience we do have control over.
And if that's your overarching experience of yourself or in life, that's patterned inside of you. It was built. It was written in the the myelinized neural pathways of your mind through experience, basically.
Right.
And then you get older and you don't understand why, and you just kind of feel at the effect of it and victimized by it, which is understandable, but not super useful for having a better experience, which is completely possible with time and the right kind of attention.
Right. So very much so. So with suffering, and the question kind of being is, what is the positive side of suffering? Typically as humans, we like to avoid pain. And suffering, for me, comes up as a negative experience. It's not necessarily something I want. However, when you actually lean into suffering, what are some of the benefits, if you will? What could we learn from that? What can we get from it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Let's talk through it. I mean, there's so many. I mean, I guess I don't get to talk to whoever or the group of whatever put this whole thing together, the designers of the thing we call our species and life as we know it. But it seems whoever did this to us, I'm kidding, let's not get all innocent. Let's not get all innocent and victimy about it. Who's doing this to all of us? Not fair. Who's the 9-year-old child playing Sims that we're all a part of? Sometimes it's weird to think about it like that. Its suffering seems to be a part of the deal, as far as I can tell. I don't, it's like, look, I don't know how to say it any other way.
But it's an
if
indication.
It's part of the deal,
It's an indicator. It's a way of,
Yeah.
It's kind of like if you if you're driving your car and it starts running low on water, as an example, if you have a temperature gauge, the indicator will start going more towards the red. If you have an idiot light, the idiot light will pop on that says, hey, here's an indication that things are getting kind of dangerously hot, if you will, which could cause some other problems with the vehicle. So suffering in the human is that indicator. It's that idiot light. It is that gauge letting you know that, hey, something is happening. Pay attention.
Yeah, totally. Grabbing your attention is one of the biggest positives or intended positives of it, I would say. And the other is since it unites all of us in a way, it is a way for each of us to connect in our own certain ways. And some people connect around different forms of suffering and
Right.
in group and get tribal around it in that way. But if you float up high enough, if you helicopter up and get some altitude on reality, you can see that we're all connected in this way and that we've all experienced pain. We all have our issues. And that old saying, it's like, you never know the battle someone's fighting, is like absolutely true. You just can't know what it's like to be someone else. You can give it a real shot and you can really care about trying to understand, but as you said earlier, you can't truly experience it fully, and that's the only way to truly understand and learn something is through experience, not through book learning or YouTube or anything. As much as I've tried, I try to read so many books and learn all kinds of stuff that way, and it's like experience is the deepest way of learning anything, even though it's a lot fucking harder, it's a lot more work, but
it is.
If what you want is to learn something, just do it. That's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
But so we're united in this in a certain degree. I think that's important. It's like it tethers almost 8 billion people together at a very deep, very profound level. It catches your attention to things. Now we get out of global and into super local, as in, when you're in suffering or in pain in your life, hopefully you can notice it. Suffering has this pernicious effect, that old like frog in the boiling water. If you put a frog in a pot of cold water and turn the heat on, eventually it goes from cold to boiling and it won't notice the difference and it will die. If life has been hard and arduous and kind of suffering from the beginning, you might not understand that you're suffering as an adult right now. You might just say, this is how the world works. This is how people are. This is who I am in relation to all that. And you might normalize it, which is really a bummer, but that's everyone's choice at the end of the day. But if you don't, and you're suffering, and as you said, it catches your attention, it's like you knocking on your own door saying like, hey, let's pay attention to this, let's do something, let's create the experience to unlock this door, walk through it and get on the other side of something and have a different experience. That's probably the most important thing about it. It's an indication of movement towards self-actualization, if you will take that deal, which most people won't these days, or well, I don't say most humans do not answer that call these days. And that's not like a wagging the finger kind of thing. It's like, I don't think we've set the conditions in our culture and in our education or in just in the zeitgeist of the species right now to teach people that this is how it works and this is what they should do, and that with time and a little bit of effort and maybe going through some emotional pain, well, that will end eventually. Like, it can be better. People just don't have access to that information on the broad scale yet.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's a certain level of uncomfortability around suffering. May it be your own suffering or somebody else's suffering that you care for. And that is just like, kind of scary. Haven't had to deal with it. Don't want to deal with it. And so it seems like, we definitely tend to push away from it. But kind of using the car analogy again, if you ignore the fact that the car is overheating and that it needs some attention, and it could be as simple as, it's we just need to add a little water. I get that way with headaches every now and then. I'm like, got a little headache going on. Maybe I just need a little bit of water because I haven't had much water today. And then voila, I paid attention to the pain, the suffering, and have made a choice to take action. And then there's, that's kind of like physical pain, if you will. And then suffering is can a lot of times be more of a mental pain, at least what we're talking about, right? Because if you've got some illness or something, that's not the kind of suffering that we're talking about. There may be pain and suffering that comes with it. And we're kind of talking about, geez, I'm just not happy with my life. And, as you mentioned earlier, if you see that, if you identify that that's just the way the life is, and you've normalized it, and that this is now your base for what is expected, and you're okay with that, good on you for surviving. Yet take the opportunity to look into that suffering and see what is causing it, because a lot of times it can be a little fix, other times we got to go a little bit deeper, but without leaning in, we don't know. And I also feel that with suffering, it's something you have to live over all day or all the time. So even when you are feeling good and happy and you don't feel like you're suffering much and you're having a good time, all of that crap, if you will, hasn't gone anywhere. And so your body is having to manage it, deal with it energetically. And that's energy that could be placed in other constructive ways that could build your life and kind of grow it in a way that you want to have. Building the life that you want to have doesn't have to include suffering. And not that you will never suffer, because you're going to. If you have a pet, the pet's going to die more than likely before you do. We're going to go through those levels of suffering, and that's okay. It's really that chronic suffering that's ongoing that is not being addressed that we're really talking about.
Yeah, and you bring up a really nice point. I don't think this is really what we're going to talk about, but we'll sprinkle this in kind of thing. There is important to useful suffering as well towards things that you want. So the process of mastering something in your life, you will suffer to do that, and there's no way around it, and that's an important part of it. When you have a child, you will suffer because you had a child, because you're not sleeping anymore and you're getting barfed on and they're screaming and you don't understand why, and you need to hold it together, and you're sleep deprived and holding it's like you will suffer by having a child, but that is useful because you will grow from it, and they will be better because you showed up as a leader and someone powerful. If you progress in a job that matters to you, and you do well because you like it and it's important to you, and you progress in it, you will suffer because of it. There'll probably be long nights or tough power games or whatever it is. It's so suffering, you can make that distinction in the way that there's stress that's not useful and sucks, and then there's useful stress. It's you can have useful suffering as well, but that's not really, we're talking about pointless suffering here today for the most part. But I just want to throw that distinction in because it is important to mention.
This is one of those topics that's huge. I mean, suffering it's so trying to chunk it down can be a little difficult, in the sense that there's just all these different variables. And it's really, I think suffering is part of the tragedy of life. And it is a lot of times creates limitations in our lives, especially if people normalize it. And when it's interesting, because when it gets normalized, now that is part of your knowing that you're alive is part of what you normalize. So if you remove suffering from the equation, how do you know you're alive? And that is the best way to freak out your critter brain, is when it doesn't know how it's going to survive.
And you've built an identity around being at the effect of the person who causes your suffering, or the thing that causes your suffering, which is really, really tricky. any way you slice it, it's really tricky if that's a person or a group or a thing or a political party or some other nation or whatever it is.
Right.
It's also really tricky if it shows up in the form of like chronic pain or like kind of debilitating mental stuff like depression or chronic anxiety and that stuff. It's like all these things are solutions inside of us to suffering inside of us as well.
Right. Right.
Tricky business.
It is tricky business, and I think the first step always recognition, but then number two is having the courage, if you will, to kind of lean into it. And when you're in a place where you feel like you're suffering, is go, okay, instead of shying away from it and trying to find a distraction and trying to find, whatever it is, so that you don't have to experience what you're experiencing, realize that you're experiencing something because there's something going on underneath. It's kind of like the princess and the pea. If the pea wasn't on the bed, right, she wouldn't have felt a little bump. I wouldn't have experienced the pain, and therefore I wouldn't know to kind of like, investigate what's going on. Oh, there's a pea in my bed that is bugging me. And so then you have the opportunity to remove it. Now, if only it was that easy in life when it comes to identity and belief and all the different structures and cycles and things that we've created over the years, but it literally is that simple as a concept. Identify what is causing the suffering, and then we have to change the what we make of it, because a lot of times what is quote unquote caused the suffering, where we learn to suffer, a lot of times there's a lot of misinformation involved in that memory, that experience that we had, that kind of locked in this belief that suffering is hard. And this is all part of a natural way the brain works also. It deletes, distorts, and generalizes reality all the time. And a lot of times just kind of, just a little reframe in what was going on there in your experience is essentially the same as removing the pea from the bed.
Yep. I remember that story from childhood.
Do you?
Big callback.
All right. I don't know. I could tell you how many mattresses didn't she put
I don't remember.
a gazillion mattresses or something like that?
Yeah, I don't even remember why she was being tested either. I don't know. I just remember the pictures and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Felt that pee in the bed. So suffering.
Good times.
It unites all of us, which gives us the opportunity to have a connection with everyone on the planet and empathy for everyone on the planet in a global sense. And in a directly personal sense, let me just say this, and we can circle back. It gives you the impetus to move towards the innate need, in my opinion, to self-actualize, to bring out what is the best inside of us. Which is a suffering task in and of itself.
Right.
Multiple hero's journeys inside a massive hero's journey, which involves pain and terror and all kinds of craziness, mostly emotional. None of this is really actually life-threatening anymore, but it feels true inside of ourselves.
Right.
So, and if you can take it in that way, it's positive. And the more you move forward and the more you're, as we call it, in rapport with yourself, the more you understand yourself, the more you understand your emotions, the more you're in touch with how you're feeling, the more you're in touch with how you're treated by other people, the more you can get away from stuff quickly if you don't like it, the more you can notice something in your life, you can notice your history repeating and you can do something about it. You can interrupt that, not be at the effect of it necessarily.
Right.
So suffering has this useful, innate, built-in utility to nudge us forward. And I don't think we have a choice. Well, we do have a choice. You don't have to answer the call at all. but you will suffer because of it. And that's not a threat. It's just kind
It's
of,
just the way it works.
I don't know. I don't really like absolutes, but this one's kind of like, that's
Right.
just the way it is as far as I can tell. I don't know. I'd
Right.
love to be
Yeah.
proven wrong, but
I
I
was gonna
can't
say, yeah, if
see
someone's
it.
got a different experience they'd like to share, we'd
Yeah.
love to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. I'm totally open to, I will suffer being wrong if I
There you
can
go.
learn something, you know, I
Yes.
will do that.
Very nice. Well, it's just I was thinking you're kind of mentioning, how suffering unites people and brings them together. And it it is it's amazing at such a deep level how well it does that.
Yeah.
And it's just I was just kind of thinking of just how vastly different it is because suffering can be just miserably painful. It can just be excruciatingly painful at
Mhm.
times. And then there are times where that collective, how well it just brings people together, and people will overcome years, decades of resentment, of whatever else is going on in their life when we have a shared experience through suffering. So it's just interesting how it is that through pain comes the bonding.
Yeah.
And here we are trying to create a world that's pain free where everybody's
Mhm.
happy all the time, and yet we're still suffering through that ideology of trying to be pain free. And yet
Yeah.
how important suffering could actually be or is, for bringing people together.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it brings people together, which is good, and then if you stay there, it instantly becomes wildly problematic. Because if
What do you
you
mean by
make a
staying there?
home, uniting with people in a common experience is great, but if you stay bonded by a painful common experience, you have to repeat the
Mm,
common
okay.
experience to stay bonded with
Right.
each other.
Okay.
It's just how it works. If you're united in pain and victimization, who are you without the pain and
Sure.
victimization?
Right.
And you talk about how much you hate it, but at the deepest driving level, it's highly valued by the
Right.
system, not by your conscious thinking mind, probably, but um, by the thing or multiple things kind of doing it here.
Right.
That's what's driving this experience. So I heard was dating a woman once who had gone through sobriety with AA. And the thing she described about AA is it kind of had it, it's not said explicitly, but
Mhm.
it kind of teaches people that you need to stay there forever or
Mm.
else you will fail and not get what you want and do
Right.
well. And she said, it's a tool, it's just the raft. You need a raft to get from one side of the river to the other, but you never want to stay on the raft.
Right.
And I thought that was really, really profound. So if you find yourself in united in suffering with people, it's a raft
Right.
to connect with people, but you want to be united with people who are moving towards better things in their lives if that's what you want.
Correct.
Or
Right.
else these people will unconsciously keep you stuck. They will hold
Right.
you down. It's like they call
Well,
it,
it's that
I think
common
the saying in
cause.
Australia. Yeah, well, it also gets really dark too, and I think in Australia they have the saying like the tall poppy syndrome. The tall poppy gets chopped down,
Mhm.
or the idea of like if you see a barrel of crabs, like if a crab's about to actually get out of the barrel, they will grab it and pull it back in. It's
Hmm.
that kind of effect.
Interesting. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about really, really dark zero sum human shit
Yeah.
here, but
Well,
there's
there are.
plenty of it on the planet. So I'm not going
Yeah.
to pretend like this should be denied because it's kind of hard to talk about or look at.
Right.
This is pernicious and it's like, I was going to say everywhere, but it's
It shows up a
almost
lot of places.
everywhere. Yeah,
Well, I
it
think
shows
yeah,
up.
because
There you
it's
go. It shows up a lot of places.
it's part of belonging, right? And
Hmm.
so, but if it's like, okay, can we belong and succeed?
Hmm.
And and build people up, or do we have to belong by holding people back and going, all right, if you step outside of these bounds that we've determined are the bounds that are required for belonging, and if you're going to go outside of that, we're not going to support you. So it's kind of two different ways of looking at it.
And in fact, you will be the enemy to a certain degree.
Correct. Yeah, I was told, I forget who told me, they were Jehovah's Witness back in the day. And they said one of the reasons why they want people to go out, knock on the doors, and spread the word of Jehovah's Witness is so that they can be ridiculed and they can be just, essentially just like go ridiculed. I'm trying to think of another word, but I'm going to go with ridiculed. And so that when you come back into the community and share that experience, now the elders can go, see, this is why you belong here. Other people don't understand you. This is why you belong here. So it's part of, and it all front facing looks, go spread the word. You're a believer, go spread the word so we can have other believers. They get ridiculed and other things. You come back and it's like, yep, that's why you belong here. You got to stay in the safety of the circle. And I don't think that is really beneficial. It's not helpful for people. In the long term, because you're creating control essentially and manipulation at that point.
I don't know much about Jehovah's Witnesses, so this isn't specific to them, but that's one of the main toolkits of cult leaders and cult builders, basically, is installing phobias about the world outside of the cult, basically.
Yeah.
It's super dark and super effective to the people who have the receptors to operate in that kind of system.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, suffering.
Bring back good memories.
Just switching into some old stuff. It is interesting to think about the way it just permeates human experience. When I think about what I know about history, it's almost like the stuff that gets talked about involves like suffering and horror. It's kind of like the way the news operates by choice these days, but I don't know if history is the same way. It's like history is not, it exists there, so it's not there, but it's not full of like the joys and the wonders and the incredible things on the planet, although of course it's there. But the stuff that stands out is the bloodiest wars and like the most powerful tyrants and like the craziest deceptions and backstabbing and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting.
Right.
And I think the news operates in a pretty dark way, but to a certain degree, it's kind of in rapport with how our minds work. It's like,
well, very much so. Otherwise, people wouldn't watch it.
Exactly. And if in a capitalist society like America, if you could build a business around just good news about really heartwarming things all the time, it would exist. But it doesn't probably hold people's attention,
Right. There's a couple of channels on YouTube, as an example, that are very niche places, and I think it's great that we have those, because when people are in suffering, it's nice to go look at all the happy things that are going on in the world also, and remind us that there isn't something else going on. Also, it sparks a memory. There was a gentleman, this is early days of the internet and reviews and all those types of things. This gentleman ended up getting canceled by the credit card service itself. And so what he did, he was selling products, and what he realized is that as he got more negative reviews, he got more attention. More attention he got, people naturally found his products and ended up buying them for whatever reason, even though there's all these horrible reviews. So independent credit card merchant accounts. So as a business owner, you got to go get a merchant account so you can take credit cards as sales. Individual credit merchants were canceling him and going, look, we've got way too many complaints. Things are bad. We're not going to do business with you. Enough merchants canceled him that finally whoever runs the credit department, may it be Visa, MasterCard, I have no idea,
Mm.
they finally said no. They go,
Ooh.
nobody is allowed to do business with this person. But apparently he was very successful. And that's exactly
Really?
the road that he went down. He was
Mm.
all about negative reviews. He was all about terrible service, and apparently he made a lot of money.
Mm.
Seems like he created a lot of frustration for himself, or just a lot of commotion, but however that served him in the ways that it needed to.
Yeah.
Not the way I want to deal with life on a regular basis, dealing with complaints and anxiety and frustration and all the other
Yeah,
stuff
and
that goes with it.
causing that experience in other
Yeah,
people's lives.
yeah,
Like, you don't want to be, on some level they're choosing that too, but being like the source of so much
right,
annoyance and suffering, you got to be in a pretty dark place yourself already.
right.
Probably deeply repressed. Maybe he probably felt great all the time.
Yeah,
It's
could
like the
have.
darkest people on the earth sleep like babies at night for the
Right,
most part because they're not in touch with this stuff. They're so out of touch with themselves that they operate over this nuclear waste pit inside of them and don't ever really contact it, actually.
right,
It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
right. Yeah, yeah. And then on the flip side, you have people who are so empathetic and so caring that they don't know how to disassociate with it and allow people to have
Yeah.
their own experience, right? It's like,
And that's the big cosmic joke, or at least one of them. It's like that person and these empathetic people find each other and do that a lot of the time so they
yeah,
can play out this dance,
yeah,
like, and suffer. My goodness.
yeah, yeah. It's sorry, earbuds been in too long. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I've really gone this deep, and we've only scratched the surface at this point with suffering and how much of a thread it is in life and how important it is. I mean, it really is a common thread through everybody's experience, and it is a way of
Mhm.
holding humanity together in the ways that it does.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Well, there just seems to be this innate way we do it to ourselves. I mean, I think about not all the time, but a lot. It's like war is such a weird, interesting phenomenon to me personally. There's
Hmm.
so much of it, and it's so consistent in human history. I mean, we just ended the longest one ever in America, recently. Even though war's evolved itself, we were at war for so long, and as an American, you didn't really hear about it or think about it very much if you weren't involved, or if you didn't have a family who was a service member or a
Right.
friend or something like that. It didn't get much coverage. It didn't get talked about very much, which is very weird in my opinion. All like the fact that it's been normalized to the point where it wasn't even a big deal is very weird and not so good in my opinion. But that's
Hmm.
completely topic for another day. And I've lost where I was going. Where was I going with this, Ron? Damn
I have no idea. It was somewhere great, though.
it. Oh,
Somewhere great.
there we go. Micro suffering. Oh,
There you
there's a new term. Can
go.
make
Micro
everything micro
suffering.
now. Yeah.
We
Having
should
a,
we should coin that. Coin it. Get a
yeah,
website. Create an herbal tea for micro suffering.
yeah. Oh, that's not a bad idea. Every time you have a micro suffering, just
Yeah,
have this herbal tea to get over it,
there you go.
move
Life
forward.
will be good. Life will be good.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
All
it's
right.
kind of this is almost a universally true statement, but things operate inside you the way you hold them. I don't think that's 100% true all the time, but it's really close.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can hold suffering as a useful part of being yourself and a natural part of things, it can be an impetus to grow, to move towards what you want. When you
Right.
put your attention on the things you want in your life, what you want to create for yourself, the barriers to that and the beliefs that are holding you back from that and limiting you present themselves. Maybe not directly, but sometimes they do.
Right.
but they'll show up in the ways that you suffer as you try to move towards it. And then you can take that suffering as an indicator towards what needs to be revised and looked at and worked
Right.
on as you move to what you want. It can be an incredibly useful tool
Yeah.
in that way. I
Yeah.
think that might be the most important thing to take away from this
Yep.
for living a more authentic and more enjoyable life.
Yeah.
You know,
That
hold this
that was a
thing
nice
in.
little package there, Will. You just
There you
wrapped
go.
that whole bow, the whole
Yeah.
9 yards. Nicely done.
Yeah. We'll write that on the box of like micro suffering tea, tm.com.
I like it. Yeah, and I think,
Yeah.
the only thing is if you find that you're suffering in the ways that you do on a regular basis and you're not happy about it, what Will said is so important. And it's really a matter of being able to kind of lean into it instead of not addressing it. Just lean into it, identify how is it serving you, in what way is it serving you, because it is, otherwise it would not be there.
Yeah.
So we all have choices, and sometimes we believe that our choices are predetermined or preset by the families or the environments that we were raised in. And yes, they're very instrumental in who you are. However, ultimately, you have definition over who you want to be. And that does take some suffering to work through in order to grow and identify how that pain is serving you. Because it is serving you in some way, in a positive way. And I think that's kind of the crazy thing for a lot of people, is to be able, well, how can suffering, being in pain, being in misery, serve me? Simple fact that you're living in it is all the indication you need that it is.
Yeah. I think it's tough. It's I mean, life can be really overwhelming and distracting, and it's hard, not for everyone, so maybe not say it that way, but for a lot of people, maybe most people, you weren't taught that this is important and you weren't trained how to do it, but being in
Right.
touch with yourself is how this gets better. And that's a moment by moment thing. It's not just like you journal once a month or something, although that's better than not doing it. So by all means do that. But if you're really unhappy with something and it's causing you distress and anxiety and depression or anger, or chronically, knowing, being in touch with that, and then kind of getting some help around it, or maybe doing some journaling or writing out some stuff if you want to go the self-healing path,
Right.
is the indicator to the progress that you're trying to move yourself towards. That's how as far as I can tell, it's like, if you hold the idea that we create our own lives, and I do, and I think a lot of people do, probably, if you're listening to something like this, then anything negative or the suffering that's coming to you is ultimately a message to yourself on the deepest level, right? There could be 100,000 realizations and to inside of you to get to that idea. So it's like, that's a very high level thing that might not feel real or useful. I understand that, but if you can kind of hold that, you can be like, all right, what am I trying to notice here inside myself, and then what can I do from that?
All right.
That might be the most useful thing to go with.
Yeah, for sure.
And know you're not alone. A lot of people who are
no.
suffering feel alone, but if you know that everyone else is going through it, and reaching to other people, that and if you're suffering, you might have patterning to where opening up about it feels like you'll be annihilated, so that's kind of a bummer, but there's plenty of people who can relate with you as well.
Right.
And if you feel like your struggle is unique and you're very righteous, and you feel like no one can understand your pain because it's so special, know that that's also a compensation, and probably not very useful at the end of the day.
Right.
that's more like making a home of something than trying to get out of it.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe
Which
we need to start our own organization, SA, Suffering Anonymous.
suffering. Yeah, and the point is to get in and get out as much as you want, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Although maybe if you're dealing with suffering, that does kind of, again, we talk about a lot on the show. The goal is probably not feel pain, you know, emotionally, because that's
Right.
just kind of how it goes. And the point is not have problems in your life. That kind of just seems to be how it goes. The point is to have more interesting, better problems to
Right.
solve in your life. I mean, that's what you're going for here. And to notice when you feel painful emotions and painful experiences inside you, to be able to move out of them, revise them, and complete them faster. That's kind of the goal. Not that they'll never exist, because
Right.
that's a bit of a fantasy and kind
Yep.
of childlike, to be honest. Not in like you're being a child, but it's like if that's kind of the fantasy running, it's a bit of
Right.
frozen mentality in a younger age that's kind of operating right there.
Right. But if you
When
could,
you
if your problems a year from now, if like you're like, ugh, the stuff I got to deal with, those problems, that suffering was better than your best day today, would you be okay with that?
Yeah, that's the
And
goal.
yeah, that's the goal. Just level up the suffering in
Mhm.
ways that it won't be as impactful, and more than likely you'll be able to move past the suffering because you've created systems and ways of managing and dealing with it and leaning
Mhm.
into it versus straying away from it and pushing it away, resisting it. And as the old saying goes, what you resist persists. So
It's a very true saying.
yeah.
Some people like to lob that at you when you're in pain. That's not usually all that useful, but as an overarching statement about every aspect of life, it's an
Yeah.
incredibly useful thing to keep in mind,
Yeah. All right.
because we usually resist the painful patterns that are inside of us. Instead of doing something about them, we hold them at bay. But when you
Right.
hold them at bay, all your attention is there holding it, as opposed to just completing it and having it discreate or dissolve,
Right.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Powerful stuff. All righty, sir. I think I'm good. I think you really gave it a nice bow there at the end. Nicely done.
Thank you.
It was a
I
good wrap up.
channeled it from beyond. Just kidding. I don't know what. I don't even remember what I said. But
That's right. You said it well. That's the important
I
thing.
think we solved all human suffering today. Let's give
Woohoo!
ourselves a nice big pat on the back.
Great. I'm gonna. I'm like, oh, it's almost it's coming up on noon. I'm like, how am I gonna deal with my suffering? Is it gonna be pizza or Mexican food? Pizza, Mexican food.
Yeah, common, very common way of dealing with the suffering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
suffering solutions. Suffering solutions.
That's a tough one, man. Those are two. I mean, those are probably the top two. So
Yeah,
it's like
and they're
choosing your
both within
favorite
walking
child.
distance.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah. Someone's got to live the life, though.
someone has to have the good things in life, right?
That's
So we can
right.
all aspire to that.
That's
And
right.
thank you for
Yeah.
doing that for
Yeah.
us,
You're
Ryan.
very welcome. You're very welcome. All righty. Well, I think with that,
Buddy.
we'll call this a close for today's episode. And but we'll be back next Tuesday, 10:15
Yeah.
in the morning, bright and early. Ideally on both Facebook and the YouTube.
Ideally, yeah.
Ideally.
Why are they making us suffer? We're just
I
trying
don't
to
know.
contribute to their platforms,
Yeah.
just trying to help people.
They must have known.
Why are we so victimized by these
Uh,
people? Oh,
yes.
God.
All righty, man. Always a
Uh,
good time chatting with you. Until next Tuesday, hope you all take care. Bye.
all right.
All right. Streaming.